Montana Territory. Late spring of 1884, the wind howled low through the pines, and a rider with a bloodied shirt and a busted saddle came through the trees like he had been spit out by the mountains themselves. Aurelia Ramsey was chopping firewood when she heard the hoofbeats. She paused, axe mid-swing, and stared toward the ridgeline. Folks did not come up this far, not without reason, not without trouble. The man slumped forward over his horse, dust caked thick in his hair and across the slope of his shoulders. He was bleeding from somewhere under his coat. When he looked up and met her eyes, it wasn't fear or desperation she saw, it was something steadier, something that reached past pain. "I don't mean to bring any trouble," he said, his voice rough and low. "But I think I'm out of options." Aurelia dropped the axe and walked toward him, boots crunching over pine needles. She had lived alone in this cabin for 9 years. 9 winters of snow that came early and left late. 9 springs of planting, summer of tending, and fall of storing. She had not spoken to another soul in over a year, not since her last trip down to the trading post in Deer Lodge, but she looked at the man, dusty, bleeding, and quiet, and something in her lungs shifted. "You can tie the horse there," she said. "Come inside before you fall off." He did not argue. Inside, she helped him onto the cot near the hearth. His coat peeled back to show a long, shallow cut down his side, not fresh but not healing either. She cleaned it in silence. He hissed once but kept still. "What happened?" "Ambush," he said. "South of Helena. Someone wanted my horse more than I did. I didn't give it up." She tied off the bandage with firm hands. "Looks like you won. Only just." She brought him water and a strip of smoked deer meat. He drank like he had not had clean water in days. Maybe he had not. "What's your name?" she asked. "Farlan Vaughn," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "And you?" "Aurelia Ramsey." He nodded, eyes scanning the cabin. It was small, one room, a stone hearth, shelves lined with jars and tools. Everything in it was touched by her hands, worn by use. There was a quiet to it, not just from being remote, but from being lived in without anyone else for so very long. "You live out here alone?" "For 9 years." His eyes met hers again. "That's a long time." She said nothing, just handed him another piece of meat. That night, she let him sleep on the cot. She took the floor near the fire, wrapped in her old quilt. She lay awake a long time, listening to the even rhythm of his breath. It had been a long time since someone else had breathed under her roof. In the morning, he was still there. And the horse was still tied up, munching hay she had laid out. She made him boiled oats and strong coffee. He ate like he meant to earn it. "Why were you riding alone?" "I take jobs where I can," he said. "Cattle drives mostly. Sometimes I help folks move freight." "I was heading to Butte when that ambush happened." She nodded slowly. "You can stay here until you're strong enough to ride." He looked surprised, maybe even touched. "I do not want to take advantage." "You are not." Aurelia was not sure why she said it. Maybe it was the way his eyes softened when he said thank you. Maybe it was the way he moved careful, like he knew what it meant to be grateful. She learned in the days that followed that he was 31, same as her. He had been riding since he was 16. Never married. No children. No land to his name. But he knew how to mend tack, fix a creaking door, and sharpen a blade. He helped her without asking, hauled water, stacked wood, even repaired the chicken coop after a fox tore through it one night. She watched him from the porch one evening, arms crossed over her chest. He was hammering a loose board in the fence, sleeves rolled, the light catching the lines of his jaw. He looked like he belonged there. That thought startled her. Aurelia had not let anyone belong in a long, long time. She told him one night, while they shelled beans by lamplight, about the reason she came here. How she had left Kentucky after her parents died. How she had been engaged once, but the man had gone west and never returned. how she had built the cabin herself, year by year, with nothing but hard hands and stubbornness. "I needed to know I could survive," she said. "You did more than survive," he said, voice low. "You built something out of nothing." She looked at him. He was not handsome in a polished way. He had a crooked nose, a scar along his cheekbone, and hands that bore the story of labor. But his eyes, they looked at her like she was not just a woman in the woods, but someone worth staying for. "Why did you not leave sooner?" he asked her one evening as they sat on the steps of the porch, watching the sun melt down behind the trees. There was no one to leave for. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Maybe there is now." Her breath caught. She turned her face toward him. He was not smiling, but he looked steady, like he meant it. Aurelia did not know what to say. So she leaned her shoulder against his just for a moment and let the silence cover them like a blanket. The next day, she found herself humming while she swept the floor. He brought her a flower, just a little wild bloom, and set it on the table like it was nothing. But her heart thudded hard in her chest for the rest of the day. He stayed another week. Then another. By the third, his wound had healed, but he had not left. Every morning, she found him already outside, chopping logs or feeding the hens. Every evening they shared stories, small things, laughter. He told her about the stars in Texas, about the time he broke 3 ribs falling off a green horse. She told him about how quiet the woods got in winter, how she once saw a bear watching her from the ridge. One night, as the wind brushed against the cabin and rain tapped gently at the windows, he reached for her hand. She let him. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "I have not felt at peace in a long time," he said. "But here, with you, I do." Aurelia looked at him, and something inside her broke open, not in pain but in relief, in warmth, in something she had not let herself believe in for years. "You do not have to go," she said. His fingers tightened around hers. "I was hoping you would say that." The snow line still clung to the peaks, but the valley had begun to warm. Sap ran in the trees. The hens laid more regular, and the creek behind the cabin swelled with meltwater. Farlan had been there nearly a month. On the morning the beehive split, he was the one who noticed it. Aurelia had been kneeling in the garden, coaxing early shoots from the earth, her hands buried in soil. He came up the path with his sleeves rolled and a calm urgency in his step. "There's a swarm headed for the pine hollow," he said. "I'll go after it if you've a spare box." She wiped her hands on her skirt and stood. "Behind the shed. You'll want the smoker, too." He didn't hesitate, just nodded once and took off at a steady jog. She watched him go, a narrow smile tugging at her mouth. Not many men would charge into a cloud of bees like it was ordinary work. By dusk, the swarm had settled into the new box, and Farlan's hands bore 2 stings, one on his wrist, another on the side of his neck. Aurelia dabbed them with vinegar and wrapped a cool cloth around the worst. "You could have left them," she said, voice low. He looked at her with steady eyes. Felt wrong to let something useful drift away. Later that night after supper, she brought out a piece of polished cedar from the storage chest. She hadn't touched it in years. Set it on the table beside him, along with her carving knife. "You ever done woodwork?" Farlan ran his thumb along the grain. "Some, not well." She settled across from him, knife already in hand. "Then you'll learn." They carved in silence, the fire popping low. Farlan worked slowly, whittling the cedar into a long, smooth handle. Aurelia shaped a spoon from the same block. When their tools paused, the quiet between them felt full instead of empty. "I figured I'd die alone out here," she said, eyes on the grain. "You still might," he said, gentle. "But not if I've got anything to say about it." She looked up then, and he didn't look away. The next day they went hunting together. A doe had been grazing near the ridge, and the signs were fresh. Farlan took lead, bow slung across his back, though she carried her own. They moved through the trees without speaking, boots silent on damp earth. When the moment came, he raised his hand to stop her. The doe stood broadside, watching the wind. Farlan waited, then let the arrow fly. It struck clean. They dressed the animal together, working in practiced rhythm. Farlan held the hide taut while Aurelia made the cuts. When they'd packed the meat, they sat beneath the ridge, sharing a strip of dried apple. "You're good at this," he said. "I had to be." He nodded and looked across the valley. "You ever think of what you'd do if you left?" She pulled her knees to her chest. "I wouldn't know where to go. I've been gone so long, there's nowhere left to miss." He chewed a moment, then said, "What if you weren't going alone?" That night, she found him outside, fixing the gate where a year of weather had warped the hinge. He didn't notice her at first, hands busy with the brace. She leaned on the porch rail and watched him work by lantern light. "You planning on fixing everything before you leave?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Was thinking I might fix everything and stay." The words hung in the air, soft but certain. "I don't need a man here," she said. "I know," he replied. "But do you want one?" Her breath caught. She stepped down off the porch and stood beside him. The lantern cast golden light across his jaw, his collarbone, the careful set of his mouth. "I might," she said. "If it's you." When he turned, she didn't move. His fingers brushed her cheek, calloused and warm. She pressed into them just enough. "I'll build another room," he said. "If you want space." She shook her head. "I've had enough space to last a lifetime." He kissed her then, not hurried, not hungry. Just steady and real, like a man who'd been looking too long for a place to land. Behind them, the lantern flickered in the wind. The trees whispered above, and the night wrapped around them, quiet and whole. By early June, the cabin no longer felt like it belonged to one person. Farlan had built shelves in the corner for his tools, but Aurelia had started storing preserves there without thinking. His saddle sat beside hers in the lean-to, and sometimes, when she reached for her coat, she found his hanging beside it. The rhythm of their days settled into something that didn't need naming. She still rose early to feed the hens and tend the garden. He still split wood or walked the perimeter for signs of cougar. But in the quiet spaces between work, something deeper had begun to grow, anchored not in grand gestures, but in the way she passed him the knife without asking, or how he left the last spoonful of coffee for her without a word. One morning, the wind carried the scent of juniper and something else, smoke, sharp and unwelcome. Farlan had already stepped out with the rifle, but she caught up to him near the tree line. "That's not from our chimney," she said. "No," he agreed. "And it's too far west to be from Deer Lodge." They followed the scent through the trees, boots muffled by damp needles. The smoke began to thin, but the tracks they found were clear wagon ruts, narrow and fresh, cut deep into the soft earth. Not freight, not settlers. Just one wagon, and light at that. Farlan knelt beside them, fingers brushing the edge of a print. 2 horses, 1 rider walking. "The load's not heavy enough for trade goods," she said. "Could be a trapper, or someone running from something." They didn't follow farther. The tracks veered off toward the river basin, and the smoke was already fading. But that night, as they sat with their dinner between them, roasted grouse and boiled greens, Aurelia asked, "You think whoever it is might come this way?" He chewed slow, eyes steady on hers. "They could. If they're lost or looking for shelter. I don't want anyone bringing trouble here. I won't let them." She didn't press further. She didn't need to. The next day they worked in the root cellar, checking for moisture and rot before the summer heat settled in. The air was cool and close, lit only by the lantern Farlan held steady. She crouched near the back wall, tapping jars and listening for cracks. "You ever think about raising stock?" he asked. She looked over her shoulder. "I thought about goats once." Changed my mind when I remembered how they chew through fences. He chuckled just once. Not goats, then. Maybe a few milk cows. Chickens are fine, but they don't keep you fed in winter. She stood, brushing her hands on her skirt. You planning on staying long enough to see winter? He didn't smile. I'm planning on staying. They came up into the light, blinking against the brightness. He set the lantern down, but didn't go far. She turned to face him, arms crossed. What would you want here if it were yours too? He took a moment before answering. A smokehouse, a bigger table, maybe a dog. Folks leave dogs behind all the time. She nodded once. A dog wouldn't mind the quiet. He stepped closer, lifting a piece of straw from her hair. His hand lingered at the edge of her jaw. Neither do I. Later that week, a letter arrived. Farlan had gone to the bend in the road where an old trapper sometimes passed through with news or mail. The man came twice a season, no more. This time, he'd brought a folded paper wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine. Farlan laid it on the table without comment. The envelope was stained at the corners, addressed in a careful hand neither of them recognized. Aurelia opened it slowly, unfolding the paper with calloused fingers. Inside was a note from a woman named Ruth Larkin, who said she'd once known Farlan from a cattle drive near Laramie. Her husband had died that spring, and she was moving east with her brother's family. She wanted to tell him goodbye, and that she hoped he'd found someplace he could settle. When Aurelia looked up, Farlan was watching her, arms crossed over his chest. I didn't know she'd write. You too close, he shook his head. She was kind. Nothing more. Aurelia folded the letter again and slid it into the drawer with the matches. I'm not asking you to forget your past. I haven't, he said, but I'm not living in it either. That night they lay together for the first time. It wasn't planned, nor did it come from some moment of passion. It was quiet, like everything else between them. She found him sitting on the cot, shoulders bare, reading one of the books she kept by the hearth. When she crossed the room and took his hand, he simply stood and followed her to the bed. Afterward, he brushed her hair back from her cheek and said nothing. She didn't need him to. In the stillness, with the oil lamp flickering low, she traced the edge of his collarbone and whispered, "You're not just a man passing through anymore." "No," he said, "and I won't be again." Outside, the wind moved through the trees, steady and full. Inside, the warmth between them held like a promise. The hayfield beyond the creek needed cutting by late June. The grass had grown tall and thick from the rains, and Aurelia's scythe hung sharpened by the door. She'd always worked it alone, row by row, her back aching by noon. But that morning, Farlan rose before her, already binding leather around his palms when she stepped out with her coffee. "Thought I'd start early," he said, nodding toward the field. "Sun's not high yet, and the grass'll keep its sweetness if we get to it now." She handed him a biscuit, still warm from the coals. "That blade'll pull your shoulder if you don't pace yourself." "I'll mind it," he said, taking a bite. "I've cut worse." They worked in rhythm, the swish of the blades like breath pulled through teeth. Aurelia kept her hat low, sweat slicking the back of her neck. By midday, they'd cleared half the rise. Farlan paused only briefly, drinking from the tin flask he carried at his hip. When they stopped to eat beneath the cottonwoods, he leaned back against the trunk and watched the clouds drift eastward. "You ever think on what it'd mean to raise something from the ground up?" he asked. Aurelia chewed a strip of salted pork, gaze fixed on the wind moving through the grass. "I already did," he nodded once. "I meant with someone." She didn't answer right away. A woodpecker tapped high above them, measured and patient. "There's a difference between needing someone and choosing them," she finally said. "I never had room for the first. I might for the second." He didn't press her, just leaned his head back and closed his eyes, sun warming his throat. That night they sat outside after supper, the sky painted in long strokes of orange and violet. Farlan had brought out a small tin box, dented at the corners. "I carried this a long time," he said. "Used to keep letters in it. Now it just holds pieces." He opened it slowly, revealing a few folded scraps of cloth, a rusted coin, and a broken spur. "This was my brother's," he said, lifting the spur. "He drowned crossing the Cimarron when I was 17. I kept this to remember what not to waste." Aurelia looked at the box, then at him. "What are you holding on to now?" He closed the lid. "Not as much as I used to." She reached out and touched the back of his hand, her fingers cool from the evening air. "You don't have to let go of everything." He turned his hand over, laced their fingers together. "I'd keep this," he said, his voice low, "if you'd have me." She didn't answer with words, just leaned her head against his shoulder and let the quiet settle around them like dusk on the hills. The next morning, they rode out to the ridge with 2 mules and a length of rope. A tree had come down near the upper trail, and blocking it meant anyone trying to pass through the basin would be forced closer to the cabin. Aurelia had noticed it days ago but hadn't had the strength to clear it alone. "I scouted it last week," she said as they rode. "Didn't want to risk it shifting downhill." "Good thing we waited," Farlan said. "We'll need both mules braced to drag it straight." They reached the trail by midday. The tree, a heavy bellied pine, had split near the root and wedged itself between 2 boulders. Farlan measured the angle, then tied the lead rope low around the base. "Once it shifts, it won't stop," he said. "Stand wide." She nodded, watching the line tighten as he urged the mules forward. The log groaned, then shifted suddenly, cracking free from the rocks and sliding clean down the slope. Dust rose in a thick breath, and then all was still. Farlan turned, wiping his brow. "That'll do it." Back at the cabin, she poured water from the barrel into a basin and handed him a cloth. "You don't have to prove anything to me," she said. "I know," he said, dipping the cloth and wiping his neck. "It's not about that, it's about building something that holds." She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You want it to be here." "I want it to be with you," he said. "Wherever that is." For the first time in longer than she could remember, the thought didn't feel like a risk. That evening she brought out a folded piece of linen from the chest beneath her bed. It had once been part of her mother's apron, worn soft by years of use. She hadn't touched it since Kentucky. "I never thought I'd sew again," she said, laying it on the table, "but maybe it's time." Farlan watched her thread the needle, his eyes steady. "What are you making?" "Curtains," she said. "For the second window." He reached across the table, brushing a thread from her sleeve. "Means you're planning for light." "I'm planning for both of us." He smiled, then not wide, but deep enough that it reached his eyes and picked up the scissors without asking. Outside, the moon rose quiet and full over the trees, and inside, the cabin slowly became a home made for 2. The first letter came folded into a merchant's bill of sale, handed off by a passing freight team heading east from Missoula. Farlan found it tucked between pages of seed orders Aurelia had forgotten she'd placed the winter before. He recognized the handwriting before she did. "From your cousin," he said, holding it out across the table. "Return address says Fort Shaw." Aurelia didn't answer right away. She took the letter with careful hands, eyes tracing the paper without opening it. "She was married to a cavalryman," she said after a moment. "I haven't heard from her in near 7 years." She slid the letter into her apron pocket and stood. "I'll read it later." They didn't speak of it again until the next day when she brought the letter out while he was repairing the latch on the shed door. "She's widowed," Aurelia said, her voice flat. 3 children, wants to know if she can come." He set the hammer down slow. "Here, with me." "She says she remembers the place, says it's the only place she could think to go." Aurelia didn't meet his eyes. "I said no." Farlan stood quiet for a long stretch. Then, why? She's not built for this life. Not anymore. And it's not just my life now. He stepped close, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. If you'd wanted her here, I wouldn't have stood in your way. I know, she said, but I don't want to be needed like that anymore. Not by someone who only remembers what they want to. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. We've got our own peace to tend, he said. And it's enough. That summer, she learned the way his laugh turned quiet when he was concentrating, the way he shook a pan of flour before adding it to the batter. He found her humming when she worked the loom, a low tune with no name. They marked days not by the calendar, but by what grew: beans curling around the trellis, first tomatoes ripening near the porch. One afternoon, Aurelia returned from the South Ridge with a brace of quail and found Farlan leaning against the barn, a square of paper in his hand. She raised an eyebrow. Another letter. No, he said. Deed transfer. She set the birds down and stepped closer. What kind of deed? He passed it to her, the ink still sharp. It was a land claim filed under both their names. 70 acres, extending to the edge of the creek and including the timber lot behind the cabin. You filed this 2 weeks ago. Had the trapper carry it in? She looked at the paper, then at him. That's a long walk for a piece of paper, he shrugged. Felt right to make it official. She folded the deed and tucked it into her skirt pocket. You always plan this far ahead. Not always, he said. But I know when to put down roots. That night, as they sat beneath the stars, she reached for his hand and held it in both of hers. I've never worn a ring, she said. Never thought I would. He didn't answer, only leaned closer, forehead resting against hers. We don't need a preacher, he murmured. Not if you say yes. She nodded against his cheek. Then yes. They married the next morning, alone beneath the cottonwoods. She wore a dress she'd sewn last winter, faded but clean. He wore his best shirt, the one with the wooden buttons she'd carved herself. They said no vows. Just stood close, hands joined, and let the silence speak for them. That fall they built the second room off the cabin's north wall. She worked the saw while he drove nails. By first frost, it held a bed and a small table, a place of quiet retreat when the wind howled too hard through the trees. They harvested the last of the squash and hung onions from the rafters. He hunted elk before the snow, and she cured the meat over oak smoke. They stored enough to last through February, maybe March. Snow came early that year, heavy and wet. The cabin stayed warm, the fire crackling steady, the windows thick with frost. One night, as they sat with a quilt draped over their knees, Aurelia looked across the room where her loom stood quiet and untouched. I've been thinking, she said, about trade. He leaned back, brow raised. I could weave again, she said. Make something folks might want. You'd have to go into town more. I don't mind that anymore. He reached over, brushing his thumb across her wrist. Then we'll take the wagon in spring. When the river thawed and the maples budded, they did just that. They loaded 6 blankets and 5 rolls of cloth dyed with walnut hulls and sunflower petals. Rode the wagon into Deer Lodge, the first time for both of them in nearly a year. People stared a little. Some remembered her. Farlan never left her side. They sold everything by noon. The general storekeeper asked if she'd bring more in the fall. On the ride home, she leaned against him, the wagon creaking beneath them. You ever think we'd be here? She asked. No, me neither. The land stayed theirs. The cabin grew by another room 2 summers later, when she found she needed a place for the loom and the bolts of cloth that had begun to pile. He built her shelves and a slatted window that opened toward the ridge. They never had children, but they raised dogs, 2 of them, both strays that followed Farlan home one muddy spring. Sometimes, neighbors passed through. A widow from the valley came with a broken axle, An old ranch hand asked for water and stayed long enough to fix the fence. They always left with something: bread, cloth, kindness. Years passed slow and full. One morning, as she stood by the garden fence, watching the mist lift off the grass, Farlan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "We've got old," he said, voice warm against her neck. "You first," she said. He chuckled and she leaned into him, the smell of pine and earth rising with the sun. The land held them. The love held stronger, and the quiet between them always full.